Professor Lucan Way, thanks very much for joining our interview series. Let me start right away with the first question. In your view, what are the main factors driving the global rise of populism and authoritarianism today? How do these factors differ across regions, and are there shared elements that make populism a global phenomenon?
So I think there are a number of factors. I mean, one thing that I think traditionally, sort of people have made two arguments that sort of one see populism as a function of sort of economic discontent or neoliberalism and sort of the function of the financial crisis of 2008, whereas other approaches tend to see populism as a function of more cultural factors, fear of the kind of increasing empowerment of visible minorities. So, for example, in the United States, you have experiments done where they show, that if you mention that visible minorities are likely to be very soon the majority of the American population, people feel kind of quote unquote racial threat, which motivates them to support kind of racist parties. Now, most studies on a sort of one-to-one basis, if you sort of as a kind of horse race between those two types of variables, economic variables and more cultural backlash variables, cultural backlash tends to be much more prominently associated with support for populism. So I think the evidence is on the side of so these more cultural backlash variables, at least in most studies. And I think it takes on different forms in different cases. So in United States, it's a historically, especially in 2016, has been a function of backlash historically against the civil rights movement and the empowerment of Blacks. In Hungary, it took on the form of anti-cosmopolitanism. You had it in the 1990s in Hungary, a country that was not polarized at all, but Orban very effectively tapped into resentment against urban elites that he used to polarize the country and garner support for Fidesz. In other cases, you've had sort of anti-immigration case, but it's predominantly been a kind of cultural factor that I think has sort of united most of these movements, anti-immigrant or anti-urban elites or anti-Black.
Right. Given the decline of Western liberal hegemony and the rise of alternative power centers like Russia and China, how sustainable is the resilience of third-way democracies in regions lacking robust civil societies, economic stability? And how has the weakening of Western liberal hegemony alongside the influences of countries like China and Russia contributed to the persistence and even rise of competitive authoritarian regimes globally?
So what's interesting, is that if you look at the third wave was very much brought about by liberal hegemony in the 1990s when the Soviet Union collapsed. And for this brief, decade, essentially, period, the United States was and the European Union were the only global powers. And so that led to a dramatic increase in the number of democracies in the world. Of course, as most of your listeners will know, that really changed in the 2000s, first with the rise of China as a major economic power, and also with the rise of Russia and sort of increasing Russian military aggression, first in the post-Soviet Georgia, and then, of course, most recently in Ukraine. So that kind of period of liberal hegemony has ended. So given the fact that liberal hegemony led to the rise of democracies, you might think that the end of liberal hegemony would lead to a dramatic decline in the number of democracies. But that has, in fact, not been the case. That instead, what you have is a sort of increase in third or fourth wave democracies, and it's more or less remained stable since the 2000s, with a bit of a dip in the number of democracies in the last decade in a few countries like Venezuela, Hungary, and the like. So in fact, I think so far at least, democracy has remained relatively robust, and much more robust certainly than you would think, given the kind of current zeitgeist.
Right. In cases like Hungary and Turkey, we see competitive authoritarianism taking root even in the countries with democratic traditions. What strategies have leaders in these countries used to effectively erode democratic norms while maintaining electoral competition?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Turkey is a case where, they didn't have, it was a military, it wasn't a democracy for very long. They had military rule, which, I think for a period of democracy, and then Erdogan. So I would question how much of a, at least years of democracy Turkey has had. Hungary had about 25 years of democracy. But I think that, the strategy, and I think this is very relevant right now for the United States, has been above all to gut the autonomous, independent bureaucracy, sort of remove the civil service, and politicize the state. So this, I think, is the sort of Orban plan, and I think this is a very common strategy, which I very much fear could sort of, be in the United States, where you kind of, so in the Hungarian case, they argued that a kind of deep state was controlled by communists, and they therefore needed to gut it, to sort of remove those officials, but then they would replace them with supporters of the ruling Fidesz party. And I think that is very much sort of on Trump's agenda right now in the United States, which is, I think, a source of deep concern.
Right. How resilient do you believe liberal democratic institutions are to the pressures posed by populist leaders and movements? What mechanisms or strategies have been most effective in safeguarding democracy against authoritarian shifts?
Well, a few things here. I think it's important to distinguish between the quote unquote far right and anti-democratic parties. I think those are confused. So I think, it is possible and, quite frequent to have a kind of, if you term it, far right party that is anti-immigrant, sort of anti-rights for certain sort of sexual minorities and trans and stuff. But, that doesn't necessarily mean that those parties fundamentally attack democracy, right? That those are two separate things, right? You can have parties that oppose immigrants that are even racist, but not necessarily, violate, core democratic institutions. So we find that, for example, in Italy, Meloni, she has not, I mean, she's, by definitions of sort of attacks on more on immigrants has been far right, but has not actually attacked minorities. And I think, that we just, I think, that might be the case also in, in other cases, and perhaps in France. So I think we need to sort of bear that in mind, not to conflate those two things. One is sort of opposition to sort of minorities or immigration, and opposition to democracy, that those are two separate things. So I think that's important. In the United States, they are very much combined, that you have, anti-immigrant party, which is also very anti-democratic. So that's, but of course, the United States is the largest democracy, or, the oldest democracy. So that's, of course, of deep concern.
All right. Considering recent shifts in European policies, particularly Germany's defense initiatives and economic distancing from Russia, what do you see as the long-term implications for Europe's role in promoting and defending democratic values globally?
Well, I think, right now, Europe's main concern needs to be security. And I think that sort of for many decades, I think we, including myself, sort of did not consider the importance of a robust military to the preservation of the liberal world order. But clearly with, Russia's violation of the international norm of not invading other countries, and its robust, its interference in democratic elections in the United States and in Europe, that is of great concern. So I think that right now I think the liberal countries outside the United States are kind of waking up to the idea that they need to actually really spend money on military, both to defend Ukraine, a democracy which has been directly attacked by Russia, but also the realization that if you don't, defend Ukraine, this will have profound global implications in terms of the frequency with which countries attack other countries. And of course, I think that the biggest concern right now on that front is China, potentially invading Taiwan. So I think, here you see very direct attacks, literal military attacks on democracies that I think that the liberal West needs to sort of focus on preventing. So I think, in a sense, that is, we're sort of beyond the point of, in some ways, promoting democracy like in the glory days of the 1990s, and much more on sort of actually maintaining the physical security of democratic countries.
Right. In your article, The Resilience of Democracy, Third Wave, co-authored with Professor Steven Levitsky, you contend that the findings of VDEM and Freedom House may be exaggerated and don't entirely reflect the real state of democracy. To what degree do you think the current narrative of democratic decline is overstated? Do you believe the data truly indicates a global democratic backslide, or are we seeing shifts in how democracy is interpreted? Has your perspective changed in the light of Trump's election in the US and the recent success of far-right parties in Europe?
Yeah, so I think that in terms of VDEM and Freedom House, the data actually is, I don't see necessarily a reason to question the data. It's more the rhetoric around that data is sort of in their reports that have a kind of hyperbolic quality to it that it does not actually reflect their data. So it's really the kind of these groups' interpretation of their data, which I feel like has been geared towards attracting very over-the-top language, that has been geared towards attracting media attention, whereas their data so far, I guess emphasized so far, has shown a kind of stasis that things are more or less the same. And I think, the problem with that is that you're not going to get, phone calls from the Washington Post or New York Times if you have a report saying, well, things are basically the same. And so they've sort of had these sort of hyperbolic claims that, the situation with democracy has returned back to the 1980s, which is just demonstrably false, and actually not reflected in their data. And also with this sort of liberal usage of words like autocracy, and say that, more than half the world is living in an autocracy. And I think that hinges very much on calling India, for example, which I think is obviously a very large democracy, an autocracy, which I just want to talk a little bit about India and the importance of competitive authoritarianism, and sort of understanding what's going on now in the world. So India under Modi has engaged in all sorts of abuse in terms of attacks on opposition, attacks on the Muslim population. In the run-up to the last election, they sought to freeze the accounts of the opposition Congress. So in that sense, it was definitely, behaving in an authoritarian manner. But the elections, as we saw, are actually still, largely democratic and resulted in the loss of majority for the ruling BJP, so that they had to kind of form a coalition. So, I think, at least according to sort of common sense understanding of autocracy, we would not think of countries where elections are still quite meaningful and determine who gets to stay and keep power. And I think that, so it's a kind of very misleading to say that Indians live in autocracy, even though, so it's much more of a case of competitive authoritarianism. And these are cases in which which elections still are real and effectively determine who gets to gain and keep power, but in which you have all sorts of authoritarian abuse, attacks on opposition and the like. So I think that's important. And I do, yeah. So.
All right. Given the increasingly unfavorable international environment, why has full-scale authoritarianism failed to make a comeback? What are the international and domestic roots of resilience of competitive electoral regimes?
So I think, my two answers to that. I think the first is that if you actually, the world has become a lot richer in the last generation. So the number of high-income countries has doubled since the 1980s. And there is an incredibly robust correlation between sort of wealth not rooted in oil wealth and democracy. So among high-income countries, according to the World Bank, if you exclude sort of petrostates like Kuwait or Saudi Arabia, which base their sort of wealth on natural resources, fully 95% of high-income countries in the world today are democratic, and the only exceptions are Singapore and Hungary. And so what you've had, and this is a correlation that, you know, a relationship that has been maintained over decades. It basically, you know, in the modern era has remained quite robust. And so the increase in wealth in the world, you know, since the 1980s, I think contributes to the stability of democracies in places that, you know, historically where democracy has been quite weak, Romania, Portugal, Greece, and the like. You know, these are all now high-income countries, and I think it's so in a sense, it's the domestic, you know, economy and the sort of the high levels of that capitalist development that sort of prevent these countries from fully backsliding. The second element is that even among sort of middle-income countries, I think we sometimes forget how hard it is to create authoritarianism, to maintain authoritarianism. So that, you know, the same kind of economic crisis and the like, and, you know, popular dissatisfaction that could undermine democracies also undermines authoritarian regimes. And we saw that most sort of stunningly in Bangladesh over the summer, where, you know, incredible dissatisfaction with Sheikh Hasina, the sort of autocratic prime minister, contributed to her ouster. So we tend to sort of assume that it's, you know, it's only hard for democracies, but it's also hard for, you know, authoritarian regimes or competitive authoritarian regimes to maintain power for this, you know, because of, you know, general dissatisfaction with the economy, with corruption. And I mean, Bangladesh was a very specific case because you had sort of, you had dissatisfaction over sort of the quota system, but you also, you know, had very high unemployment and the like, which contributes to dissatisfaction and the limitations on the power of the autocratic leader.
All right. You argue that there's considerable evidence that Russian President Putin's attack on international norms could ultimately strengthen the liberal world order. Can you please explain how that could happen?
Well, you know, so I wrote that piece shortly after shortly after the full-scale Russian invasion in February of 2022, and I think it was impressive the degree to which the West united in support of Ukraine. I think that sort of Putin had been hopeful that Europe and the United States would not respond, largely because, you know, the Russian state has sort of maintained corrupt relationships with members of the European elite, most stunningly Gerhard Schroeder, where he was paid millions by Russian oil companies and basically completely bought off. So I think he sort of felt that he kind of at least was able to divide the European elite. But I think the horrific quality of the invasion kind of shocked people and sort of pushed them into action, and remarkably, you know, led to the disengagement. You know, this, you know, so initially at the time of the invasion, Europe was heavily dependent on Russian energy resources and is no longer really very dependent. I mean, that's quite a remarkable shift. So I think there has been, you know, I think it was kind of, many of us were pleasantly surprised. At the same time, I think we're very much hardly out of the woods. I think there's continues to sort of be a bit of dithering on the part of European powers and sort of a lack of recognition that they really need to build up their militaries to defend against a Russian threat. So I'm still, and I think, you know, the war is likely to still go on for a very long time. So I'm not, you know, I think certainly Putin hopes, and I think I wouldn't discount the possibility that sort of, especially with the election of Trump, that you might see a kind of divisions in Europe and sort of along the lines of Orban in Hungary, who has sort of been very pro-Russian, or the Serbian power. So that, I do very much worry about that.
Right. Why do some authoritarian regimes survive for decades, often despite severe crises, while others collapse quickly, even absent significant challenges? How do you explain the nexus between social revolution and authoritarian durability? One of your articles suggests that many democracies in lower income regions remain competitive due to authoritarian weaknesses. Could you expand on the dynamics that keep democracies stable in these challenging environments?
So the question of why social revolutions result in stable autocracy, that's one question. I think that we wrote a book on that. That's basically has to do with the fact that social revolutions, like in Russia in 1917 or Cuba in 1959, almost always lead to civil war or violent conflict, which basically allows them to create a very unified elite that's maintained, where they maintain unity because of the threat of outside threat, siege mentality. It also allows them to build a strong military and allows them to wipe out alternative centers of power, such that you have a very weak civil society. I mean, this is very much, I think, typified by China today, right? Which is going through sort of economic problems, but basically, it lacks any kind of serious opposition that could sort of take advantage of any kind of discontent with the current Communist Party. So I think that's what helps it sort of remain in power.
Right. With the election of Donald Trump as the 47th president of the US, how do you think American institutions will react to his autocratic tendencies?
I'm very worried. I'm extremely worried. I think that on the one hand, I think this is unlikely, very unlikely almost, to lead to, so it's not the end of elections, it's not sort of full-scale authoritarianism, but at the same time, the American institutions are very vulnerable to politicization. And here what I'm thinking about are things like the use of the Internal Revenue Service, the sort of tax authority in the United States, to audit Trump's political rivals, or the use of the Department of Justice or the FBI to investigate enemies of Trump, right? So on the one hand, in the United States, there is a very robust rule of law, right? So that it's pretty much unimaginable that you would see sort of Trump being able to jail Kamala Harris or leaders of the Democratic Party. Nonetheless, it is very imaginable that he could make life, very difficult for those who oppose his presidency, by having them audited, or businesses that give money to, let's say, Josh Shapiro in the United States is the next, presidential candidate of the Democratic Party. You can imagine Trump going after businesses which try to donate to Josh Shapiro, and the like. That is very imaginable. Or else you also see this recent bill, which I think has so far failed to pass the House in the United States, that you could deprive NGOs of nonprofit status if they quote unquote support terrorism. And that's a very kind of vaguely defined, which would allow the Secretary of Treasury to sort of very arbitrarily deprive certain sort of more left-wing NGOs of nonprofit status, but maintain nonprofit status for right-wing ones. So there's all sorts of possibilities for more subtle forms of abuse that aren't necessarily going to sort of, be dramatic and, garner newspaper attention or whatnot, that aren't sort of jailing of political candidates or killing of protesters, but are more behind the scenes, like, auditing, which is kind of a little bit harder to see. Is sort of, it's hard to kind of understand, at least for outsiders, how much, is the IRS disproportionately, auditing Democrats over Republicans. That's not an easy something to answer. It's not something that you sort of see in front of you. So it's much easier to do because it's much more opaque. So that I very much worry about. I actually think it's, incredibly likely. I would be very surprised if that kind of thing does not happen in the United States.
How do you think populism in the United States and populists worldwide will be impacted by the election of Donald Trump?
Well, I think initially, certainly, it's going to give all sorts of fuel and confidence to them. At the same time, I want to say that that I think what drove, I think so far, I mean, we were still kind of crunching the numbers, so to speak, on the most recent presidential election in the United States. But I think what drove support for Trump, it wasn't sort of a fundamental shift to the right as much as deep anger that populations have against incumbents. And, that's basically, the kind of silver lining for those of us who oppose these guys is that, now that they're in power, that anger is very likely to be directed at them. So I think it's just hard to be an incumbent anywhere. So if you look at since 2013 in rich democracies, by our count, 15 of 18 elections in rich democracies have resulted in the the ousting of incumbents. So there's this intense and anti-incumbent anger at those in power that I think has very much drove the last election in the United States. I mean, what's puzzling, I actually, to be honest, don't completely understand what's the source of this anger. You have inflation, but inflation in the United States was 14% in the 1980s. It's about 2.4% now. You have very low unemployment, almost 4%, which is almost at the level of full employment. I mean, the economy is doing fairly well, so it's a little bit puzzling, what the source of this anger is, and the perceptions of the economy seem out of whack with what the sort of objective indicators of the economy are.
And lastly, Professor, on Moldova, how do you explain the electoral victory of Maya Sandu despite heavy Russian influence?
Well, one, it was very close. I think there was two elections. There was a referendum on joining the EU, and her election. It was very close, and so it was definitely a nail biter. But I think that I'm guessing that Moldovans are terrified by Russian influence. I mean, it's look what happens to their neighbor in Ukraine. I think there's this long tradition, as I've written about in Moldova, about sort of anti-Russian sentiment. So there's definitely sort of among the sort of more Moldovan/Romanian nationalists. So there's a kind of basis for that. Yeah, so I think that is that's a bit of good news. I think in Georgia, it's disappointing for many of us to see the I think it looks like the sort of pro-Russian party was able to sort of use fraud to sort of stay in power, so that you have like good news in Moldova and not so good news in Georgia.
Right. Professor Way, thank you so very much for your time. I appreciate it.
No problem.